Hey everybody, welcome to Geeksvana Live. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many of you out here already, joining us for this particularly interesting live show. It's something we've been talking about for a while, so it's a process that we're interested to start in, and it's something which we're going to be talking about an awful lot on Geeksvana over the next few weeks and months, because this is an important one in terms of ensuring that we get our views across to the CAA and then, of course, across eventually to government through their recommendations as well. But thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Really great to see such a great crowd in here already. So here on Geeksvana for a while now, we have been talking about an upcoming public consultation expected from the UK CAA. The consultation would look at the fundamentals of drone use in the UK, and we were told would look to assess what works and what can be changed to maximise the drone rules for the UK. At the moment, we effectively mirror the regulations in place across Europe in the EASA member states. However, we have already started to run a different path already, with things like the C label system not being implemented in the UK, much to the frustration of many of the UK drone users. The document we are here to discuss today is the very start of that process. Now, this isn't part of the actual public consultation, but instead a call for input. There's an important distinction to make there. The CAA are looking for your feedback. However, this is very much an initial stage. The concepts and ideas are not yet fully formed, and it's possible that some or many of the concepts will actually not make it into the final future plans. Once the CAA has our feedback and other stakeholders' feedback, etc., and considers the impact of it on their ideas, they'll then form recommendations to government and start a public consultation process based on those final concepts. So this is a very important early stage where your thoughts and ideas are actually going to be very, very important. Engaging at this early stage will help us to avoid potentially some of the wrong regulation concepts even being put forward. Tonight, I'm going to run through the document and pull out the main concepts which are within it to help highlight the ideas explained, which will impact most UK drone flyers. The first point to make is that, as we suspected here at Geeksvana, the scope is going to be wider than just the open category, and it is instead a review of the UK UAS regulations as a whole. So coming up on Geeksvana over the next few days and the next couple of weeks, there will be a few shows to deeper dive some of the topics discussed within this, such as remote ID, drone classifications, airspace types, and more, including I'm going to be doing a show very soon, potentially even tomorrow if it's ready, actually looking at how this could impact sub 250 gram drones and some of the ideas and concepts around that. Today will be a review of the document itself. So as we're going through, let me know your thoughts and any questions you have in the live chat, and we'll come back and have a look through those. Also, if you're watching this and you are new, then do hit that subscribe button to get more information on this process as it comes live. As usual, it would be awesome if our regular viewers out there could actually hit that like button nice and early. Now, before we actually bring the document up and take a look at the information, I've had many viewers recently, and it's kind of related to this as well, in the run up to this, who've been asking for stats on things like flyer numbers. Well, we've spoken to the CAA, and here are the latest stats, the latest information we have on that. As you can see, the number of active flyers with flyer IDs 13 plus is 284,236. Number of under 13 flyers, just 5,678. Number of active operators, so that's individuals with operator IDs, 202,000. And number of active operators who are organizations, that should be a comma there, 6,495. Active PDRA01s, interestingly, for those who are interested in a specific category, are down to 3,094, which in itself is a story in itself, really, with the active case 1 and case 2 OAs, so OSCs holding at 109 at the moment, which I think is fairly stable, really. So, okay, so let's have a look at the documents that we're going to be talking about tonight. Let's get straight into it because we've got quite a few talking points here. I'm going to be starting with the forward, which was being produced by Kevin Wolsey, who's the co-head of General Aviation RPAS unit within the CAA. Now, I'm not going to be reading the entire document today. That would be extremely laborious. We'll be doing that with this forward. We're going to go through it just to set the scene, but we're not going to be going through every single piece. We're going to be picking out the parts of information that I've identified, which are key in terms of when we all go back and actually put our reply to this to the CAA. So This, as I say, is from Kevin Woolsey. Over the last decade, drones and other unmanned aircraft systems have become established parts of our airspace. Operations that were previously expensive and high risk have now become cheaper and low risk due to the capabilities UAS can provide. In the next decade, we expect UAS to increase significantly, delivering transformational benefits across many sectors. However, mass uptake of UAS will also change the safety and security risks that require mitigation. The CAA implements the guardrails. It's an interesting way of putting things, isn't it? That ensure UAS are operated safely and securely. However, our role needs to continually evolve, aligning to changing risks and meeting the requirements of the UAS community. The CAA are therefore reviewing UAS regulation to ensure it's fit for the future. So an interesting start there. At present, UAS regulation mitigates most risks, though placing requirements on UAS users. In the future, we plan to make it simpler for UAS users to comply with regulation. And you're going to see that I see that in this report quite a few times, where the CAA talk about the fact that they want to make, from the feedback that they've had from stakeholders, including the recreational side of things, that the current rules are felt to be too complicated, and they're looking to actually make them simpler and therefore easier to comply with. As I did joke earlier in the chat, it could also make them easier to ignore, of course, by shifting mitigations in part to UAS themselves, ensuring UAS are safe and secure by design. That to me has very long-term worrying connotations, but that's a whole other story. New technologies can make it easier for UAS users to fly safely by preventing unsafe actions from taking place. For example, geo-awareness functionality can help prevent UAS entering restricted airspace. Remote ID technology, there's the first mention of our favorite words there, can enable action to be taken where UAS are misused. So they're talking about here that new technologies are going to help to actually stop the drone itself from even flying in restricted airspace, and then remote ID will back that up so that if it should happen, that they're able to track you down and obviously take punishment where they feel it is necessary. Through mitigating risks at source, there could also be new opportunities to simplify the regulation applied to UAS users. Collectively, this approach could enable UAS to be adopted at a much greater scale, delivering benefits for the UAS community and wider public. And that sounds like, beyond visual line of sight drones, both in terms of commercial, but also, of course, the good old delivery drones, should they ever happen. But there's a very, very wide future use of UAS out there. Now, this call for input provides an opportunity for UAS stakeholders to provide feedback on how the CAA can make UAS regulations fit for the future, effectively mitigating risks while still delivering user needs, enabling the sector to grow. And we look forward to hearing your views. So, as I say, this is something which is essentially, they're looking for our feedback. They actually want to know what's going on, and throughout the document itself there are 18 questions that the CAA ask us to directly comment on. I'm going to show you in a little bit actually the how to actually we're going to go through the form of actually how you reply. It's very, very simple on the CAA's website. There'll be links in the description following the show to help you do that as well. Now, these are listed throughout the document, and there's also at the end of the document as well. They're all put there as a summary, which we will go through. So the document works by essentially explaining the existing regulation. Then it sets out the CAA description of their early thinking and then poses questions based on that. The main concepts are then discussed and laid out for everybody to be able to actually have a look at and hopefully understand. Now, moving back across to the document itself, on the page 5, after the executive summary, we have, and let me just zoom out on this to get everything to fit nicely. One more. There we go. We have these 15 key areas, which again, this document actually does work through in this call for input. So the first one is to rename operational categories. So to change the names of operational categories to be more intuitive for UAS users. So essentially dropping the open specific categories and then the subcategories A1, A2, A3, which can cause a lot of confusion, and making it more intuitive. That's going to be interesting to see. Simplify operational categorizations, improve how operational requirements are organized, update model aircraft regulation, ensure future regulation framework is suitable for flyers of model aircraft. So this is one of the first times we're actually seeing some discussion in terms of separating out really the side of the model RC from UAS itself, and that does come up specifically in this document. Supports users of non-class marked UAS. So again, obviously the people that are worried that once they do start using class marked drones, whatever they look like, whether it's the C labels or whatever system we go for, people that are worried about in terms of the legacy drones being able to be used and be able to be used in enough areas, shall we say. Adopt new digitalized risk assessment approach, expand pilot competency framework, implement manufacturer standards. So the manufacturers to use technical standards, something I think we're all looking forward to. 9 is introduce the product labeling scheme. So adopt CAA-backed labels to help consumers make informed purchasing decisions. Slightly different from the C label system, but also linked within there as well. Change product exclusions, implement remote ID, require UAS to digitally communicate ID and location information during flight. So that is within this document and within the suggested review. It is coming. Implement geo-awareness, require UAS to help prevent the flying in restricted airspace. So essentially your drone knowing where it is. I suppose you could really look at that from the point of view of a more advanced sort of DJI geofencing system, and a more precise one, I suppose, if it's actually going to stop you from being able to take off if you're in that kind of area. Improve user guidance, require manufacturers to digitally communicate safety information to UAS, and introduce user validation requirements and update policy and guidance document structure. So things like the CAP documents, the very document that we're looking at here, of course. So heading down to page 7 here, and I have the next couple of bits that I want to talk about here, where it says this call for input sets out our early thinking on potential challenges within the UAS regulatory framework today and in the future, and potential opportunities for improvement. It provides an opportunity for stakeholders to give feedback on the direction of travel and priority for the CAA's policy development ahead of a fuller consultation. Unlike a consultation, because as I was saying, this isn't a full consultation, this document doesn't set out fully developed proposals or option analysis. Responses will be considered alongside other evidence and analysis to inform proposals put forward in a future consultation. So final decisions will be made after this future consultation. So that's, again, one of the reasons why I think it's really important that we all look to engage in this at a very, very early stage, because we're being involved at the stage where the ideas are actually being formed, where the ideas are starting to actually be put together, essentially. And I think that's an important one, frankly. So as we see here on pages 8, as we move down to the next page, and we hit onto, sorry, I just moved that in the wrong place. 1.10, here we go. Responding to this call for input, we're seeking views from individuals and organizations representing recreational UAS users, commercial users, model aircraft flyers, manufacturers, technology service providers, and RAEs, amongst others. Responses are required by the 7th of September 2023 using the feedback form on the CAA website, which is this one here, which we will be running through towards the end of this. A summary of responses to this call for input will be provided within a future consultation on the proposals we intend to take forward. And that's an interesting one that we're certainly going to need to make sure that we have the CAA stick to, as it were, because they are saying here on point 1.12 that a summary of the responses to this call for input are actually going to be available to us. So I think that's an important one from the point of view that our views will be put across, and if they just blatantly ignore those views and don't have perhaps the evidence to support doing so, then we do have something else which we can start to look on there. So on page 9, we get straight into operational requirements, and there is the existing regulation explained here and described here. The UAS operators currently subject to a range of regulatory requirements relating to safety mitigations, etc. And again, we have the areas that most of us recognize: the open category, the specific category, and certified category, and as with the little blue line at the bottom here showing that the risk level increasing, so therefore the certification and permissions authorization to require also do the same. So 2.2, the UK regulation also includes requirements on the minimal technical standards of UAS used in certain categories and subcategories from 2026. Because remember, the transitional period essentially at the moment was just extended to 2026. Nothing's been replaced yet. So all of the what was going to be happening previously is still technically within there. So, and it's technically coming in 2026. So they will need to have these changes in place by then. 2.3, further requirements are set out in other regulations. For example, regulations restricting collection of personal data are set out in the Data Protection Act 2018. And of course, the flight restriction zones are within the Air Navigation Order 2016. So the stakeholder feedback providers, the CAA, has identified challenges within the regulatory framework for operational requirements. So these are the challenges that they're already saying from stakeholder feedback. So stakeholders can be a wide range of people, from RAEs, which are the training companies, police, the regulator themselves, I suppose, the public, and other other organisations, so large commercial operators, etc. So operational requirements, and particularly the system of categorisations, subcategorisations, and exclusions, are complex and challenging for some users to understand. This creates a barrier to users complying with regulations and operating UAS safely and securely. So essentially what that's saying is that there's a lot of confusion there when you start to try and dial down. So you say, okay, I'm flying this DJI Air 2S tomorrow. I have an A2 CFC, so I can fly in the A2 airspace, which means congested areas, but I can't get within 50 meters of people. If it had a C label, and we had C labels, I can get closer, etc., etc. So it starts to get a little bit complex, basically, doesn't it? And they're saying from that initial stakeholder feedback that they've already had, that's one of the issues that they need to solve. The thresholds for certain operational requirements are not suitable for evolving security and safety risks from UAS, resulting in some risks not being robustly mitigated. I think that will be talking about things like flights over people more in the specific category, but it's an interesting and very, very wide statement to make. Restrictions for how UAS manufactured before 2026 can be used, could be excessively burdensome for some UAS users. This could cause unintended consequences, such as UAS owners selling or disposing of their UAS earlier than otherwise would. Now, it's an interesting one, that point, because I don't necessarily think that the legacy side of things is actually going to be much of an issue if we are going to base something, because they surely must have to base something around the C labels, even if there's an additional. I can't see too many manufacturers producing drones with a special UK label on there personally, but I may be wrong. We'll have to wait and see. But certainly I think if we do use that, then by the time we get to 2026, there aren't going to be that many manufactured drones, at least. This isn't, of course, self-build, but manufactured drones that by 2026 won't have some form of the C labeling system on there. The approach to authorizations and risk assessments in this specific category is inefficient and time-consuming, which is creating a barrier to market participation for commercial UAS operators. And I think many people in the who do fly within the specific category under operational authorizations will certainly agree with that one. So this then leads us to the first question that the CAA are asking in this call for input. Do you agree with the challenges with operational requirements identified by stakeholders, and why? So you are basically going to need to say, do you agree with all of these? And there's actually a multiple choice a question within the response document, and essentially you're going to then have to break down what you agree with and what you don't agree with. It's an interesting way of doing it, because there are some parts of this I agree with, some parts of it I would say actually with that limited information, for instance with this second paragraph, I don't think there's enough there for me to form an opinion, basically. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually works. So policy objectives on this is the following: sets out the potential opportunities which could help address these challenges. So mitigating safety and security risks. The regulations protect flyers, operators, aviation, and the general public from harm caused by the misuse of UAS. User-centric. The users of regulation can identify, access, and understand the regulation. Enforceable, the regulation enables enforcement bodies to take action. Growth enabling and scalable. So we're going to start seeing this, and you can actually see it there in question 2. We're going to start seeing that almost as a bit of a mantra moving forward. And as it says here, should the CAA adopt the following policy objectives for operational requirements and why? Mitigate safety, user-centric, enforceable, growth enabling, scalable. Please describe any other objectives we should consider. That's an interesting one. Question 3, do you value international alignment in operational requirements and why? And I suppose we look at that from the point of view that if you look across the channel, across into Europe, the similar certification systems that we hold here in the UK will work across many member states. So I hold EASA qualifications, and I can fly under those qualifications across the 20 odd member states without having to requalify. So your A2 CFC over there works across the board, and of course you get to use C-label drones as well, but I won't go on about those tonight too much. So really what they're asking there is, do we value any more alignment in that terms in operational requirements, and why? Personally, I think that if we're not going to be part of that system, then I think it starts to lose its value slightly. But I'm still slightly confused as to why we wouldn't, as a smaller nation on the outside, adopt and continue along the EASA rule side of things, if it gives every drone user more access to those marketplaces. But again, I suppose it isn't too complex just to go and get an A2 CFC, as I have done, and other qualifications which are valid in Europe. So I suppose that's something which I think we have to look on. Okay, moving on to the next section, making sure I have the right pages here. Flipping down to page 15. And I'm going to come back to those sections in a little bit more detail. Now, page 15 talks about pilot competency, and this is a section which we are going to be skipping this evening entirely, because we've had a live show on this particular section already, but we've got another one coming up on how it will impact this, because a lot of this will be dealing with the specific side of things as well. But obviously it talks about that at the moment, beyond the Flyer ID test, there's currently 2 levels, which is the A2 CFC and the GVC. And for those that have been watching our videos on that, they're now talking about bringing that to a basic and advanced certification, basically, which I think is going to be pretty interesting. So next up, we're going to talk about product requirements. So this chapter considers the regulation that applies to UAS products, primarily applied to UAS manufacturers and other operators in the UAS supply chain. It describes the current regulatory framework in place today, the objectives we're using to inform future policy development, feedback from stakeholders, etc., as you'd expect. These opportunities cover class marking system itself, exclusions, remote ID, and geo awareness and user guidance. So this is a chunky little section which is very, very important for us all to get our heads around, but also important to ensure that we do all respond on this one. So existing regulation today, most significant safety and security risks are primarily mitigated through the actions taken by the UAS user. In the future, UAS should be safe and secure by design. This will prevent unsafe or insecure UAS operations from taking place and make it easier for UAS users to fly responsibly. Now, when I was asked a good couple of years ago where I think the very distant future of drone regulation is going. And I've always felt that if the authorities feel that we're not complying and compliance is an issue, that they'll almost take compliance out of our hands. And I've always thought that there will probably be, very much in the distance, we're talking 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, when technology has advanced an awful lot, that we'll actually start seeing drones that we have no control over, that we use with a simple tablet. The drone flies itself. We tell it what we want it to do. The drone gets the permissions, the clearances, decides if it's in the right airspace, etc., and then goes and does the job for you. That I think is very much in the future. But this kind of 3.1 section here kind of smacks of that kind of future. In my opinion, which is a little bit of a concern. In practice, this will require regulatory requirements that set minimum technical characteristics on some UAS. This could include preventing UAS from flying in restricted airspace without permission, or requiring the UAS to communicate ID data during flight, amongst others. Interestingly, for this kind of thing to happen, and therefore there to be an active map, we would of course be talking that would need to be on a network. So we wouldn't be talking about something which is going to be similar to, and this isn't the remote ID part yet, but this isn't necessarily going to be a localized system like the one that's coming in the US for now. Other general product safety requirements: no UAS specific regulations have been implemented in the UK that set requirements on manufacturers or other economic operators. However, from 2026, UAS manufacturers will be required to adopt manufacturing standards that require UAS to be safe and secure by design. The regulatory framework based on the retained EU legislation is referred to as class marking, as we've covered many times on this channel. These regulations set out requirements for 7 different classes of UAS summarized below. They also include regulations to enable the system for standards, and we all of course know the C-label system pretty well, and we all sit here pretty frustrated that we can't actually use it, of course, at the moment. But yes, so it's a system we certainly know. So the stakeholder information for this section: over the coming years, the CAA will need to work with manufacturers and other stakeholders to enable adoption of product requirements. These activities will include establishing a market surveillance authority, appointing conformity assessment bodies, designating technical standards, and publishing supporting guidance, which that's exactly what was required in terms of the CAA adopting or rather bringing in the C-label system already. So that does start to point towards, needing market surveillance authorities, etc. Are we going to see an adopted version, an abridged version of the C-labels here? 3.6, in advance of implementation, stakeholders have provided feedback on potential challenges with the regulatory framework from product requirements. The challenges identified by stakeholders can be summarized as: the complexity of the class marking framework will create barriers to manufacturers participating in the market. Move that across there slightly. The class marking framework is likely to be confusing for end users due to the number of product classes and the complex interactions between classes and operational requirements. I'm not sure I agree with that one. I think that a C1 drone, I would have known exactly what that, it's simple. To me, you don't have to understand all of the drone regulations. You just have to understand the regulations for the drone that you're flying, essentially. So if I have a C1 Mavic Air 3, DJI Air 3, Mavic Air 3, then that to me, I know that where I can fly that with the separations and everything else involved. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that particular point. Just very quickly, thank you, Shining Tech Tips, for the £10 super chat. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for everything you do. I'm taking my A2 CFC very soon with a view to provide services in the UK. You've helped tremendously. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it, and appreciate all your feedback. And thank you everybody that's been responding so nicely to the fact that we just hit 25,000 subscribers on the channel as well. I really do appreciate all of the kind feedback that people have been giving us. But back to this. The thresholds between classes and exclusions from certain requirements leads to some safety and security risks not being fully mitigated. That word security coming up again. Some regulatory requirements are not as effective as they could be in mitigating safety and security risks, and users are not communicated adequate information at the point of purchase or product setup on how their UAS, how to use their UAS safely and securely. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people, I get a lot of feedback on this. I agree with it myself as well. I'm not sure how you do it, but I think a lot of us agree that we really do need to have a situation where at point of purchase, it says or product setup. I think both, frankly, that the rules are explained and that basic compliance is brought in. There is an issue there as well, that you're kind of forcing compliance, but in terms of the information getting across to people, I would personally fully support that. Policy objectives. The following section sets out the potential opportunities. So the mitigates safety and security risks, user-centric again, and again, it's bringing that it's bringing this mantra, which I said would most likely become a mantra which we're going to hear an awful lot in the coming months. And then question 10, should the CAA adopt policy objectives for product requirements and why? Mitigate safety and security risks, etc. All of those ones again. Please describe any other objectives that we should consider. Now, the opportunities in terms of class marking, so as described in the context section, it requires them to have this. We're considering, jumping down to 3.9, we're considering opportunities to simplify the class marking framework to improve how it works for manufacturers and users. Specifically, we're considering the impact of replacing the 5 classes, as we saw in the graphic earlier, intended to be used in the open category with a smaller number of classes. So for instance, consolidating classes C1, C2, and C3 into a single class. When combined with a label indicating the product weight, this may be simpler for users to understand, facilitating increased compliance. We expect this could still be delivered through using international standards, ensuring that manufacturers aren't unduly burdened by divergences from the EU approach. So this is an interesting one. This is one of the first really chunky parts of this, that where essentially they're saying the drones will still have the C labels, but there'll be an additional UK label which will ensure the weight is on there. So again, that's looking at it in terms of enforcement as well. And I suppose saying that, essentially sub certain weights, so sub 250, sub 500, sub 900 grams, etc., sub 2 kilogram, 4 kilogram, you'll have certain freedoms, which will bring the C classes, as they're quite rightly saying, C1, C2, and C3 together. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And I think if we just have a thing of, if you have the label with the weight on there, you can do X, Y, and Z with it. I think that would, yes, be a very, very simple system that I think a lot of people will get behind. Because, of course, really the C1 to C2 side of things, with the advances that DJI have made in particular with their manufactured drones, the quality and the capability of a C1 drone is possibly beyond what they thought many years ago when the C rating system was first thought up for use in the AS estate. At 3.10, in addition, we're considering how to help users understand whether a UAS is safe and secure by design. To deliver this, we're considering implementing a CAA-backed labeling scheme for some UAS to complement the class marking framework. In practice, this scheme could allow UAS with a C1 to C3 mark to have a CAA-backed label that is easily recognizable to users. Now, one of the things that I did raise a while ago was whether or not we could have had, and even I think we could implement it now, where there could be a CAA-approved list of drones, essentially, that can be flown with an A2 CFC with C1 permissions, basically. Sorry to throw in acronyms and words there. There are going to be a few of those, obviously, with this kind of document. And I suppose in some ways, this does actually start to lead towards that actually happening in practice. It will be interesting to see how that CAA-backed label system would happen, and whether or not that's retroactive and that type of thing. It's going to be, really interesting. This could help users make informed purchasing decisions and have confidence in the safety of their UAS. In addition, this could make it easier for UAS users to understand the interactions between class marking and operational requirements. However, we would need to consider the cost and impact to the CAA and manufacturers of such a scheme before progressing with implementation. So the two questions they're asking on this is question 11, should the CAA implement manufacturing standards? Opportunity 8, and why? And should the CAA implement product labeling scheme, and why? Personally, we will do a show specifically on this. And this is, as I say, we're working through the document at the moment. There are going to be some specific shows coming up on this channel where I'm going to break down what does this mean for sub 250? What does this mean if C labels comes back in the way that they're suggesting, et cetera, et cetera. So we will have that as well. But overall, I don't necessarily have an issue of there being, of their implementing manufactured standards. I just really want them before 2026 personally, but I don't have an issue necessarily with them simplifying that, as long as simplifying it doesn't mean that with my existing C1 Air 3, I suddenly get less permissions, less benefits to fly that drone than perhaps I would in the EU EASA states under that C1 label. Exclusions in the current regulation, UAS weighing less than 250 grams. So our first mention of our much coveted 250 gram allowances, or classified as toys, would not be required to meet some product requirements, such as remote ID and geo awareness. However, this approach may not fully address the risks presented by some of these UAS. For example, some UAS that meet this criterion could still be used to infringe controlled or restricted airspace, or to collect private or sensitive data without consent. In addition, the current approach to exclusions may be a source of confusion for users when making purchasing decisions, or when understanding what types of UAS can be used in different operational categories. So here in this section 3.12, the CAA are directly saying that actually sub 250 in this country might not automatically be excluded from remote ID and the geo awareness side of things. Also, from the point of view that UAS that meet the criterion could still be used to infringe, and it says it here specifically, or to collect private or sensitive data without consent. And I think we all know where my mind starts to switch to there in terms of perhaps audit channel videos and that type of thing. There are a couple of references in here which I think do feed back to that kind of drone use, in my opinion. 3.13, to address these risks, we're considering whether approaching to the product exclusions for certain UAS remains appropriate. So opportunity 10, changing the product exclusions. Alternative approaches could involve extending some requirements, such as remote ID and geo-awareness, to UAS below 250 grams with cameras. So this would include our Mini 3s, Mini 2s, etc., Autel Nanos. In addition, we could replace the exclusion for toy UAS with a criterion based purely on weight to avoid ambiguity for users. However, we recognise that some exclusions are likely to be proportionate, for example, for very small UAS without cameras. One thing I really want to stress here is when you are replying to this, it is important that we all stress just how important the sub 250 freedoms that we have are, and just how important that is to us as hobbies, as those that use them commercially. There are plenty of people using the Mini 3 Pro now commercially, and being able to do so without a lot of overhead in terms of restrictions, etc. And I think it's really important that we get those points across. Yes, they're talking about other parts here, but for me, I worry about unintended consequences. So from the point of view that if you remember when we had the legacy transition extension consultation, and perhaps a side effect of that was the fact that we then lost any hope of using C labels before 2026. So I fear when I see this kind of language that we need to be aware of and be very, very clear in our feedback that we give en masse as recreational and commercial users in terms of what that could actually mean, and really looking behind it in terms of even potential hidden meanings there. The optimal approach taken would depend on what other changes to class marking are progressed. As discussed in the prior section, in our decision making, we'll consider how to mitigate the risks. So question 13, quite simply, is should the CAA simplify exclusions from product requirements? Opportunity 10, and why? Again, ensure that you answer this fully, and ensure that you answer question 13 in terms of being as wide as possible in terms of if they do simplify exclusions from product requirements, that it does not affect the permissions that we currently have with sub 250 gram drones. Okay, the next one, which is obviously a chunky one, and I'm just going to pause for a very quick drink. Thank you very much for hitting the like button, everybody. Over 140 likes already, with just shy of 400 people watching at the moment. It'd be nice if we can get that over 200 likes before the end of the show. I don't ask for much, do I? But the hitting that like button does help get this message out as wide as possible, basically. So remote ID, despite current UAS regulations, some UAS are used unlawfully for smuggling, harassment, and infringement of sensitive sites. The police currently have a limited ability to identify the person responsible for a UAS's operation at the time of an incident. In the future, technology will enable UAS to transmit operator and flight data during flight. This technology, called remote ID, as if with all of the remote ID coverage in the United States, even on this channel, we need much of an introduction to RID these days, could allow police to identify malicious and or incompetent operators, both in real time and historically, leading to re-education, fines, or convictions. The and historically part there is an important section, because that again informs me that we're talking about network remote ID. So being able to actually have your flights essentially stored on the cloud and be looked at afterwards, basically. So that's again a big one to remember in terms of your responses. In addition, the data provided by remote ID will enable the CAA to be more effective as a regulator by providing data on how UAS are used in practice. The data provided by remote ID will improve the CAA's understanding of the sector and enable the CAA to develop policy that specifically targets the risks presented by UAS. So essentially they're saying, in a very roundabout way there, that they believe this data will help them in the future. So if we've all got remote ID on our drones and we're all pinging that information out, it will tell them where they're being flown and where they can have BV loss. Can BV loss happen? Can other things happen, etc.? It's dangling that carrot a little bit in a slightly cloaked way in terms of, hey, remote ID will come in, but we'll get these freedoms, which I'm not convinced on personally, but we'll have to wait and see how that actually comes out. And again, it does say that UK regulation sets out a requirement to implement remote ID in the UK by January 2026 through manufacturer requirements and operational requirements. We're exploring how remote ID could be implemented, and they identify this as opportunity 11. Remote ID requires them to transmit the operator's registration number, serial number, position. So we are looking at position again. We're not at the moment. They're not from a data privacy point of view excluding us from that conversation. Altitude, route, speed, and takeoff point. This data would be readable through a mobile phone near to the UAS, i.e., Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, referred to as direct remote ID. Data would also be passed to a database over a network referred to as network remote ID. This would provide visibility in real time and create a historical record. So if you are passionate that you do not want your drone that you buy from DJI, your Mini 3, whatever drone that might be, that has remote ID built in, it will automatically require you to be online when you're flying. There's all sorts of issues with that. But also the fact that every single one of those flights will be tracked and recorded and then used in terms of building a historical record. It's vital, absolutely vital, that you get your views across on this and why you feel that is a significant issue. Cassius, thank you so much for the £2 super chat. Thanks for the updates. You're very welcome. I appreciate your direct support like that. We are exploring implementing a hybrid approach to remote ID. And this is an interesting section, i.e. both direct and network for UAS. This could be applied to UAS in the open category, if the open category still exists then, of course, that are above 250 grams or have a camera, potentially excluding some UAS, such as model aircraft, and to UAS in this specific category. We're considering opportunities to add remote ID functionality to some UAS, a legacy UAS via remote ID upgrade or the add-on modules with an appropriate transition period. This would aim to robustly mitigate safety risks, etc., whilst managing impacts to UAS users. So they are talking about, again, which is why I was really emphasizing on that previous point regarding exclusions. It's really important that we ensure that we keep the exclusions that we have for sub 250 grams in terms of the freedom that so many of us enjoy. So many people fly sub 250 camera drones that are camera drone recreational flyers at the moment. And it's really important that we keep that. This, again, reinforces why that's actually important. But again, also talks about the fact that there could be excluding some UAS, such as model aircraft. Now, that in itself is going to create issues in terms of how do we actually identify what is a drone and what is a model aircraft and that type of thing. But that's obviously, that issue does come up, but that's obviously an issue which is worth resolving, because if we can have that and we can have the model RC side of things excluded, I think that would be something that a lot of people would support. We expect remote ID to transform how security risks from UAS are mitigated. However, remote ID is not part of the airspace modernization space to enable UAS to integrate into airspace. So they're confirming here, we anticipate that other complementary technologies, such as electronic quantum computing, will also be required in some circumstances. So they are stating here quite openly that remote ID is not an airspace integration tool, that this will not facilitate, this will not suddenly become, all of that information will not go into a UTM for that particular purpose, and that remote ID is essentially really, therefore, an enforcement tool. So question 14 is a very simple one, and I know one that will be very passionately reported on. Should the CAA implement remote ID, opportunity 11, and why? I know everyone's going to have a lot to say on that question, certainly. Now, this next one, which again, geo-awareness, this is separate to a remote ID entirely, so it's an important one to run through. Regulations exist today to prohibit UAS flying in airspace restriction zones, including airspace above aerodromes, etc., prisons, as we know, etc., etc. Whilst some UAS have this functionality today, stakeholder feedback has identified limitations in how this functionality is implemented in practice. The current class marking requirements, due to be implemented in 2026, contain requirements for their intended use in the open category to have geo-awareness functionality. So opportunity 12 is implementing geo-awareness. We're also considering further opportunities to help prevent UAS from deliberately or inadvertently flying into restricted airspace. How do we all feel about that in terms of there actually being a built-in system in the drone to stop inadvertent and even deliberate flights into restricted flight areas? It would have to be a highly accurate system, a live system. So again, we know that there's going to be a hybrid network remote ID requirement. So your drone will already be online, but this will mean that it will be taking that data and stopping you from flying in places, whether or not you agree or disagree with that, basically. So it's an interesting one. We are also considering, inadvertently making it easier for users to comply. Specifically, we're considering opportunities to provide further policy and guidance related to how aeronautical data relevant to UAS is obtained and used by UAS manufacturers and flyers, strengthen requirements on manufacturers to limit UAS flying in restricted airspace using geofencing functionality or similar, to improve user understanding of the regulations regarding restricted airspace. In addition, the CAA and government are working together with our stakeholders to improve how airspace restriction zones are managed, with several actions set out in the airspace modernisation strategy. And if you want to know more about that, really want to geek out on that particular document, we did have a live stream a few weeks ago on that, so you can go back on the Watch Now on Geeksvana playlist and be able to find out all about that, including we went through the specific infographic for the lower airspace side of things. So that leads us then to question 15. Should the CAA implement geo-awareness, opportunity 12, and why? This one, geo-awareness, for me, is something we need to keep a very close eye on in terms of what unintended consequences could there be from having geo-awareness on board all of our drones as standard, in terms of, does this mean that somebody flying in the middle of Scotland because their drone perhaps can't get a signal won't be able to fly? Will those maps will it fly as long as those geo maps are updated on the drone within the last 24, 48 hours? That type of thing. I think there's a lot there we need to think about. And the geo-awareness this side is actually going to be a specific show as well for us to be able to actually break this down. The UK regulation, so the user guidance, UK regulation includes requirements for manufacturers to provide the information to notice to users at the point of purchase as made available by the CAA. In practice, this information notice could be a leaflet describing the safety and also the requirements of people, etc. Now, this one is basically when the C class came in, etc. When those drones started to be sold, there was actually a regulation within the EU regulations, which of course has been bounced to 2026 now, where the manufacturer or the retailer would have to include a leaflet to explain their requirements. That's happening over in the EU now already. We expect there are opportunities to improve how user guidance is communicated to users at the point of purchase or whilst the UAS promoting responsible UAS operation. These opportunities include, and these ones are interesting, requiring manufacturers to convey safety and security guidance to users during product setup or pre-flight via the controller or other interface. Thank you, Andrew Lee, for the £10 super chat. Really appreciate it. Geeksvana, simply the best channel for any drone user, no matter what skill level they may be at. Glad to be a part of it. And thank you, Andrew, for being a channel member as well, I can see there. Thanks for all you do. Keep up the good work. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And we do put a lot of hours into this content in terms of research, in terms of, frankly, harassing the stakeholders like the CAA. And I really do appreciate it. Of course, if people want to back us financially as well, but just the fact that we get such kind feedback from all the viewers really does help keep my motivation levels up, shall we say, when I'm trying to sift through these documents and actually get the correct information, basically. So it's something that, as I say, is already in use over in the EU in terms of leaflets. Now, this part of it where they're talking about the controller or other interface, I've had conversations with people from the CAA, mainly at one of the DroneX shows, where this was put to me actually as a suggestion, where you would essentially boot up the drone for the first time, and a little bit like there used to be a DJI sort of system that would pop up and give you a basic test, which was completely, you could skip it and that type of thing a certain amount of times. But they're talking about here actually having that information come up on the screen during your initial setup. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I have feelings both sides of the fence, frankly. And also requiring manufacturers to validate flyer or operator ID during that product setup or pre-flight to ensure flyers operators have the appropriate registration and training before flying. If a consumer is unable to provide this information, this could result in notification to users and or limitations on how the UAS can be used. And that brings us to opportunity 14, which is introduce user validation requirements. Now, interestingly, in one of our previous live streams where we looked at the CAA tracker information, if you remember that stream, those of you who are regulars here, we're nearly at the 200 likes. Thank you. 3 more people, if you could please like. In that show, we explained basically that there is a high number in terms of the responses to that focus grouping of people who are not registering their drones in the UK at the moment. The CAA put it as something like 52-53% of what they think. Obviously, you're trying to work out a figure that we just don't know, but that was the figure, the percentage that they put on it based on their focus grouping. So this is certainly a direct response to the fact that they feel not enough people are registering. For both opportunities, we would need to consider the potential costs and impacts to manufacturers, the effectiveness of different approaches, and the proportionality of any controls placed on UAS users. One of the reasons why I say I sit on both sides of the fence, Sean, why would you not want people to have to put their flyer ID, operator ID, and even go through a safety test before they fly their drone? I would. My only problem with that is they talk about potential costs and impacts there as well in that 3.27 point there. My issue with that is that those costs that can end up costing us more could put up the drone registration fee charge, etc., and could also be, put up the price of a drone. That could all happen, but then actually we end up having some hack or some software that comes in that basically hacks around that and makes it completely useless. So I wonder, and my feedback very much on that one will be around how effective and how resilient that particular software will be from the point of view that things like the FCC hack is very, very simple to do and very difficult to know whether or not. I mean, how are you going to know that a drone flying has been hacked to that point as well, basically? Obviously, the remote ID information won't be coming out showing its data. Question 16, should the CAA introduce requirements for manufacturers to provide user guidance during product setup or pre-flight via controller or other interface? Opportunity 13, and why? Question 17, should the CAA introduce user validation requirements on manufacturers? Opportunity 14, and why as well? So some interesting ones there again. And I think that when we look at things across the board here, like geo-awareness, remote ID, and the exclusions side of things, we're starting to see some change in the class marking. We're starting to see a format of the CAA's thinking, building here. And it's so important that we give them the feedback, the real world feedback of how people are experiencing drones, how people are experiencing the hobby, how it really is in the real world across the CAA in our responses. It's so important. Frankly, in my opinion. You may not think so, but certainly in my opinion. And then they talk about other opportunities, and this is one of the sections which I'll come to on a specific video. But essentially, they're talking about changing how they actually put things forward. The only thing I would say here is combining. They're talking about combining the regulations. That's fine. Replacing CAP 722 series with the extended AMC and GM, removing the duplication between these two documents and clarifying the legal status of non-legislative guidance. I think we would all love clarification on exactly the AMC and GM's weight in terms of the legislation, and it being obviously it is non-legislation guidance. And yes, I think the fact that we have 722 and AMC there is confusing and does create a lot of confusion. As I said, I'm not going to go too into depth on this one, but the AMC is where we get the visual line of sight must be within the orientation of the drone without lighting and that type of thing, etc. That's where that came into things in terms of the CAA's presumed guidance that to say that it is presumed you are flying your drone legally if you stay within that guidance. So it is important, and I think that we do need to see that happen. But I think, again, unintended consequences, I'm not sure I would like to end up with the AMC and GM alone without the existing CAP 722 series. I'm just not sure that that would be the right thing to do, but we'll have to wait and see. Introducing a new user-friendly Skyway code, introducing a new user-friendly document, modeling the Skyway code in aviation that collates the relevant regulatory requirements for different user groups. Again, yes, I think that's a good idea. However, I think that we need a better Skyway code in terms of actually showing almost I would have it split down the screen. I would show the legislation and then the CAA guidance, legislation guidance, so that you know which is which basically, and that you actually give that information across. And that then gives us the final question: should the CAA simplify policy and guidance document structure, and why? They then talk about some of the other structures. And then obviously next steps and how to respond. This call for input provides a summary of existing UAS regulation, describes the challenges within proposed objectives for future policy development, and identifies 15 opportunities for improvement. Those are the ones I went through at the beginning of this show. We welcome views from stakeholders on these challenges and opportunities. Responses to this call for input will be considered alongside other evidence and analysis to inform the scope of future policy development. All responses will be reviewed by the CAA, and remember, they do state that they are going to actually show us these responses in the future consultation. So they'll show us the feedback a little bit like they did, I suppose, with the legacy consultation. We expect to consult on a set of proposals following this call for input. A summary of feedback, as it says, will be there in the future consultation. Feedback can be provided by the 7th of September 2023 using the feedback form on the CAA website. So I'm going to put this link in into the description straight after the show, both for this document and for what we're now showing on screen, which is the call for input, the actual form itself. It's very simple. You stick your name in there, email address. You say that you're obviously, whether or not you're doing it for an organization or they're your personal views, you're able to save and come back later as well, which is handy. And then once you continue through, it asks you some details. So what UAS do you own? Are you model aircraft? Are you drone? Other? How many do you own? I did have to click the 11 plus there. Approximately how frequently do you fly UAS? At the moment it's daily. Often it's been weekly, but I found the last couple of months it's actually daily thanks to FPV. What's your age range? We'll just skip past that one. And then it comes in, and again, you remember these questions which they were putting forward. Do you agree with the challenges with the operational requirements identified by stakeholders, and why? Definitely agree, and all the way through, and please provide details. There is an I don't know section, which I think should actually be used as an important differentiator. I feel that the way that this call for input has been put together, the way that these fields actually flow, is they're taking information which is actually quite complex and taking sections which cover an awful lot of sections and an awful lot of subsections, and they're basically saying, do you agree with it? All of that in that one question. That's great because it's distilling things down, and you have to distill it down. You can't have a consultation like the AMC one, in my opinion, that is overly burdensome in terms of understanding and simplicity. But let's make sure we understand what we're doing here when we do fill this out, please, because we do not want to fall down unintentional circumstances such as the C labels being withdrawn, etc. And I'm not sure if people would have agreed to the extension of the legacy if they knew that would have happened. Should the CAA adopt the following policy? And that one there is a multiple choice, which again, I think those multiple choices do cover a lot of it, but do not be afraid to use this I don't know symbol at the bottom here. You do not have to agree or disagree with things. And then it gives you the opportunity, again, to be able to save and come back or continue on to the next ones. So that's basically the overall list. That's basically the overall 18 questions that are within this document. And again, this is pre-consultation, so I think it's interesting from the point of view of just how that's going to go and how complex the future consultation might be. But it does start to give us a snapshot. And as the fact that they're coming to us and saying, hey guys, we would like your feedback on this, we need to give it. So please, if you're watching this, do go through. Even if you are ticking boxes and giving your general opinion in those boxes, it's important we get as much information across there as possible about you and your individual experiences of the drone hobby, whether a recreational flyer or as a commercial operator as well. It's very, very, very important. So looking at the chat very quickly and seeing at what some of the people are saying here, Andrew Lee, I'll just add one suggestion. All manufacturers of UAS to include a link to Geeksvana on their packaging. I swear I didn't read this before I brought it up. Plus a leaflet suggesting users subscribe to the channel within the packaging. Hey, you know, there are other very good channels out there as well. I think perhaps actually it's not a bad idea to give a list of where they can find some help on social media. I think that would be a good idea. At Geeksvana, I firmly believe no matter the feedback, it's going to be a steamrolled, and wherever the CAA government want to implement and be implemented while stating anti-terror. Yeah, Omar, thank you for your comment. And this is a concern that I share. It's a concern that I have. The reason I'm saying still go through with this is because they're promising to also publish the feedback. So if we have a situation where they put all of this information out here, we respond en masse, which hopefully we will. The remote pilot consultation isn't going particularly well in terms of numbers right now, but the one the wider recreational side of things responded to, which was the legacy extension, there were thousands of responses to that, and it was fantastic. And they did, to be fair, listen to us. If we put all that information forward, they show us the information that came back, and they have no evidence in terms of dismissing those views and dismissing that data, then we've got a problem, in my opinion. Then we've got a significant problem in terms of whether or not that's actually fit for purpose regulation. And it almost would give us something to be able to fight if that happens, because I'm not necessarily suggesting that they would discount that. Bruce, hi, good to see you. Hope you're well, sir. There are hundreds of thousands of drones being flown in the UK. No deaths, no property damage. Obviously, the current regs are working. Why change them? Yeah, but there are wider issues, Bruce. There is criminality happening with drones. There is no risk. And again, you can't say there's no property damage because there is absolute fact with the insurance data that's out there. No deaths, fine. But I don't think you can only regulate for something because there's death. I think that wouldn't really work in terms of many things. You know, I'm not going to put parking regulations in place because no one's died parking a car. So yes, obviously the current regs are working, and why change them? I don't necessarily disagree with that, because I think we've spent a long time getting everyone used to this current regulations. Yeah, it would be a shame. And indeed, if you feel that, everybody should be putting forward and getting that across there. SMEB, what they should do is accept a 250-gram drone will be over 250 with an ID module and night strobe light, i.e. under 300 grams with safety gear on. Yeah, interestingly though, I think if remote ID does happen and it has to be for sub 250 with a camera, I think we might benefit from the fact that the remote ID has already been rolled out in other regions in the world. So things like the Mini 3 Pro does already have a remote ID system built into it. So I think in terms of that, we'll be able to counter back from that. But in terms of other things, lighting and safety gear, I don't necessarily disagree with that. And again, if I hear that a lot from viewers, and we need to put that across to people as much as possible, and put this across the CAA as much as possible, that we feel we do need that little bit of few grams to be able to put strobe lights on for night flying and even daytime as well, frankly. The Coffee Varners, good to see you. Just a thought, but I've and thanks again for being a channel member. Just a thought, but I've just flown in the wilds of Scotland with no phone signal. Absolutely. Would my sub 250 just not be allowed to take off as no network? That's an interesting one because it's hybrid. So whether or not that hybrid clicks in, and again, please do put that in your response to the CAA, whether or not the hybrid clicks in, that it allows it to just operate locally if there isn't a phone signal. But could that be abused in terms of, oh dear, I don't have a phone signal, you can stop it getting a phone signal, just stick your phone on airplane mode, but there will still be a localized RID signal out there, I suppose. But also whether or not those geo awareness maps would be updated within a certain, so you know, it won't fly if they're more than a week old or something. I'm not sure, but again, I'm not sure how that would work legally in terms of temporary flight restrictions. So it's a really, really, really good question, and one that needs discussing, and absolutely make sure that we see that in people's responses, please. Let's have a look here. XJet, why not just make it illegal to fly into restricted airspace? The regulators assume everyone will follow the RID rules, so why wouldn't they follow these other rules? Yeah, I think that's slightly disingenuous, but I understand where you're coming from your particular narrative, Bruce. Tim Long, they're just going to push pilots into going underground with home-built craft that don't have RID. Won't work, sadly, for a number of reasons. Just because your drone doesn't have remote ID transmitting does not mean that the authorities and counter-drone technology cannot see your drone. Does not mean that you're not going to get walked up to and someone's going to challenge you, and then in fact you're in immediate trouble, frankly. So I understand that, and more people will just say screw that and will be going underground, but I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the answer. Basically, I think we could end up with people actually getting in more trouble from that. Lindsay Hayes, good to see you, Lindsay. Councils will use their counter-terrorism powers to access network remote ID data for other purposes. And if the PCNY's data is not safe, NRID data will be released in time. It's an interesting one, isn't it, from that point of view? Because again, we saw with the remote ID, future remote ID video, which we covered on this channel in the US, where they were talking about, you know, agencies contacting the FBI and getting the information of the remote ID for data for those. Yeah, it would be interesting to see where they think and for what purposes other authorities, local authorities, etc., will be able to do that. It is, again, another concern. Please make sure all of this absolutely fantastic feedback is placed within that consultation response. Phantom of the Drone, why am I suddenly thinking about Skycoppers and the officer who kept blaming DJI for their geofencing, not stopping the UAS from going into FRZ areas? Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose when you look at it from a stakeholder point of view, if you were the police and if you were the CAA and you were the stakeholders responsible for enforcing drone regulations and drone legislation, then, yeah, you would think, okay, well, if we can digitally, electronically stop that happening, why not? My problem with it is the unintended consequences. But yes, I see your point from that particular show. Kieran Alsop, I think it's important to have the balance. We do have people attacking DJ audits in there at the moment as well. And he's hoping that he had a good holiday and don't listen to the haters. I don't think one of my issues, and I actually have a live stream coming up, which was supposed to be this evening, actually, which I moved a few days ago. Once obviously this stream was obviously it's going to be happening around this point on auditors, and there are good and bad auditors. There are issues with auditors using drones, etc. I do have a stream coming up on this, but the only thing I would say for people that are in the chat is don't allow others and allow people, the bad side of things, to inform your choice about everybody, and don't allow authorities to drive wedges between us and sort of have lots of infighting between drone users. If we can get every drone user flying responsibly, then in my opinion, there are no fences between them, basically, whether you're an auditor or whether you're a recreational flyer. You just have to go on social media, and there are tons of videos of people flying like absolute idiots. You don't need to go to audit channels to find that. So there's enough issues with the recreational and the commercial side of drone flyer, frankly, that we don't need to start building fences. But I do have something coming up on that shortly. Stu B, good to see you. The thing that amazes me is someone or some people are getting paid to write this rubbish. How many people have died flying drones? None. Now write laws that represent the danger. Yeah, they haven't said that it's just in terms of danger, have they, as well? So they have said in terms of security, and in terms of their job is to ensure the regulations are followed, essentially, or to try and get the regulations followed. So yeah, the whole thing of how many have died flying drones, no one's ever said these regulations are coming in because people are dying, basically. Felix, good to see you. There's not air traffic control yet. They'd have to make that in models first before geo-awareness was useful for safety and not just stopping crime fighters. Interesting point. XJet mandated geo-awareness gives the government the power to ground all drones at any time they choose. Well, yeah, I mean, technically, it would force the drones to be landed. And as I say, unintended consequences is something that okay, because some people may say, I would love my drone to know when it can take off and when it can't take off. That would be fantastic. But unintended consequences, people, in terms of the wider hit that giving away that kind of control can happen on a democracy. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole of conspiracy there, but yes, I do agree with that widely. Rob, we need to mobilize the open source community. I don't want computers telling me what I can and cannot do. It might mess up and cause a problem. Yes, the reliability of it is going to have to absolutely be something, because we don't just fly DJI drones, and the software from other manufacturers, there's even issues with the DJI software occasionally, as we know from people like Gavin HR with his excellent videos on the updates, etc., and some of the problems and teething problems they can have, where they even sometimes wind back updates. We need to know that it's going to be reliable. So I completely agree with you there. Mazam, is anything legal anymore? Won't be long before breathing in certain places will be prohibited unless you pay a per breath plan. Yeah, it feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? Although we should remember that at the moment in the UK, we have more freedom with sub 250 gram drones that we did pre-2020. And less onus on needing to be qualified to fly in congested areas, etc. It used to be very, very recently for all drones, frankly. And any others that I'm going to pull up here very quickly before we push this through. Omar's saying, according to the AMC, I shouldn't be flying some of my drones in the living room. They're that small, I can't see them at 20 feet. Indeed, although, of course, I know you're making your point. Of course, indoors isn't covered by drone regulations. Excellent. Okay, well, there we go. That is the news on this one today. And I think it's... DC drones, that's an interesting one. It would be Get Geeksvana with other YouTube creators for discussion. This is being organized at the moment, actually, and we will be having some of the usual faces on here, but also Ian from London will be joining us as well for a show next week where we're actually going to take this apart, and it's going to be it will be a bit of a geeky look at things, and it will be a bit of it will be a bit of a rabbit hole chasing thing, but for anybody that's interested in finding out what my views are on all of this in more depth, and people like Ian in London, etc., and the usual faces, then that will be coming very, very soon on the channel. Hopefully next week. It should be next week. I've got most people approving it for a date next week. But again, as I say, there is going to be a lot more videos on this coming up, and breaking it down in terms of what it means for sub 250, and looking at their more detailed things like the C labels system and their proposals there, and how that might work. So do, if you are new, as this sub little button just came up, do subscribe if you're new to get that information. Excellent. Okay, well, that's everything this evening. Thank you again for joining us. Could the 360 odd people that are still here, thank you for being here in such numbers, and for proving that the UK recreational and commercial flyers are serious people that want to discuss this kind of thing. But if you could hit the like button on your way out, I would really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time on Geeksvana Live. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.